Welcome to Raja Reads. I'm Masood Raja, and on this channel, I introduce you to books from different parts of the world and occasionally also share my views about the act of reading itself. And sometimes I talk about academic books. Today, I just thought I'll talk about one aspect of any reading experience. So, if you are an avid book reader, you might have some views of what constitutes a good book, right? Or what is good literature, or what is bad literature, right? And when you read something, you're constantly evaluating the work in that sense. So the question is, where does that gauge, right, that judgmental tool come from, right? Obviously, it's not natural, right? But we all have this sense of what we consider a good story, what we consider a good book, right? And sometimes different groups can have similar views of what constitutes the literary or what constitutes good literature, right? And so, obviously, a lot of great scholars of literary studies have opined upon this, right? And whatever I'm going to say here is completely derivative. None of it is my original idea, right? Or my original concepts. I usually rely on British scholar Terry Eagleton's discussion of the literary and what constitutes good literature. In his book, Literary Theory and Introduction, in the first chapter, he actually puts the very question of literature itself under challenge, right? Because he asks this question, right? What is literature? And then he goes through an explanation of how people have tried to define it. That in 18th and 19th century, it was something that was imaginary or imaginative. So anything imaginative could constitute literature. And then he realized, and we realized, and the readers realized that sometimes, mundane things can be highly imaginative, but that doesn't make them literature. And so many times, there are literary things that we read that are actually not fiction nor imaginary, but they're about real life things. I mean, think of some writings, scientific writings. I love Lauren Isley, right? And his famous essay, The Snout, which is actually about evolution. But if you read it, and I highly recommend it, it is in his book, The Immense Journey, you will see that it is one of the most literary renditions of the questions of evolution, of human evolution. So this idea that anything that is imaginative and fictional constitutes literature falls apart. Then Eagleton also introduces us to the formalists, the Russian formalists. I have a brief lecture on this channel on formalism. And these were the people who basically asserted that what constitutes literature is the form, and within that, the devices that writers use to create suspense, to make language strange, right? Especially in poetry. And Eagleton kind of dismantles that argument as well, because he's basically saying, considering your own state of mind, a simple sentence could be estranging. Does that make it literature, right? He famously gives this example of dogs must be carried on an escalator on a railway station. Does that mean if you're drunk and you're reading it that you can't get on an escalator if you don't have a dog, right? Or that anyone getting on an escalator must carry a dog. I mean, so anything that can be strange in reading doesn't necessarily become formalistically literature. So what Eagleton then concludes in his discussion that our idea of what constitutes good literature is ideological and it is socially produced. So depending on what our class is, what our politics is, which school did we go to, what did our teachers teach us about the value of good literature or its good characteristics, what we have learned from our parents, from our friends, the books that we have been exposed to, all of them come together to constitute our sense of what is good literature. And it is that knowledge, socially produced values, ideologically produced values, that we take with us when we perform an act of reading. So our views of literature or literariness are not natural, right? They are constituted through our experiences, through ideology, through our social position in the world, and through our education. So what is at stake if we agree to this assumption, right, as readers of literary texts? Think of it. If we believe that what comes across to us as good literature and bad literature, right, that evaluative system is socially constructed, ideologically modulated, then there is a possibility for us to change it, right? If I read a book and I am aware of my own views of it, but I also leave myself room to ask myself, why do I read this book this way? Why am I evaluating it this way? And that tells me, oh, it's because this is my politics and this book disagrees with that or misrepresents that. Then I can understand my response better, right? But beyond that, if I realize that my values are bigoted or sexist, right, or too entrenched in one way of thinking the world, so there is nothing wrong with the book, then my values are outdated or outmoded or plain simple wrong. So when that happens, that means we can change our way of evaluating good literature. And I can give you a great example from my own life. I was educated in a boarding school with the British system. To me, the British aesthetic values of the 20th century were the values that I took to English literature. That's how I judged it, right? But when I came to United States, I studied with good professors, Americanists, post-colonialists, professors who came from the left, who didn't take any literary tradition for granted. That is when I started questioning the primacy of British literature. I saw into its imperial history. I saw that it represented the sensitivities of a certain class in Britain, and that it reproduced a certain view of colonized natives, right? I became a post-colonialist. So what values to me as a reader shifted. What I consider good literature shifted. Not because that literature had changed. That literature is still the same. But the way I evaluate it and value it has changed, right? So that's my point. That as you read and form opinions of any given text, may it be a novel, a short story, a play, a poem, don't just take that evaluative system as stable and fixed, right? Ask yourself, why do I think this way about this story, right? What are my preferences here? What are my prejudices? What are they formed in? Do I need to change them, right? And that would enable you to be constantly in control of your readerly self, right? Because you're constantly transforming it. And your reading habits would become more egalitarian, more attuned to the nuances of your own preferences and prejudices, and not necessarily about the fixed value of a given text, right? I think that is transformative. And as teachers, if we use this tool to discuss these things with our students in this sense, think of what we could accomplish instead of forcing them to adopt what we think is good literature or good way of reading literature. We are encouraging them to question our assumptions, but to take our assumptions and what we teach them and formulate their own ways of reading. Now, a cautionary note here, there are no individual evaluative readings of a text. If you have read your Stanley Fish, you already know that we are always in one or the other interpretive community. What that implies is that we are formally or informally part of a group, an interpretive community that has certain rules of reading, that has certain conventions. We internalize them, we use them, right? The question isn't that we should be able to step outside of an interpretive community. The question is to question the very assumptions of our own reading habits and find out what kind of an interpretive community I am a part of. And then ask ourselves, do I need to change it? And even if you don't want to change it, at least be aware of it, right? So these are some of my thoughts on the practice of reading, how it is not natural, how the way we evaluate literature is socially produced, ideologically produced, and that being aware of it would not only make you a good reader, but also a good teacher. And if you are into that kind of a thing, a good writer of critical essays and books. That's all from me today. I hope this was useful to you. Let me know what you think. Let me know if you have other views about what constitutes good literature. I would love to hear that. And if there is anything that you would like to point out, post it in the comments. I would love to see them. And as always, please stay safe, take care of yourselves, take care of each other. And from me to you, until I see you next time, as always, peace and love.